Okay, good morning, everyone. I guess good afternoon for those of you dialing in from overseas. I know Epigenomics has a big following in Germany, so we've got some people from Germany calling in. My name is Hogan Mullally. I'm one of the founding partners of Encode Ideas. We're excited to be having our first webinar of what we hope will be a series of webinars with companies that we cover or have an interest in. We're really pleased to have Epigenomics as our first company to join us. Amongst our coverage universe, this is the company that has the biggest milestone and the nearest term milestone on its horizon. So I'd like to thank Greg Hamilton and Jorge Garces of Epigenomics for joining us and agreeing to be our first company for this webinar series. We initiated coverage on Epigenomics in June. And I have to say the investor feedback we've received has been remarkable. We've had tons of positive interactions with investors on our investment thesis here. I'd like to thank both Greg and Jorge for making themselves readily available for a number of one-on-one calls. We're pleased to see the stock behaving really well. So it's been a really positive launch for us and something that we think will be continue with that sort of positive trend as we head into this sort of massive inflection point for the company, which is the August 28th preliminary CMS reimbursement decision. Before I turn it over to Greg and Jorge to introduce themselves, just from a sort of disclosure perspective, I'd like to highlight the fact that the partners of Encode Ideas do own stock in Epigenomics. We purchased that stock in the open market. We have not received compensation for our research, nor have we received compensation for hosting this webinar. We do stand to potentially earn compensation from Epigenomics in the future. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Greg and Jorge, if they could each introduce themselves. Maybe Greg, you could kick it off and then turn it over to Jorge.
Well, thanks. I'm Greg Hamilton. I'm CEO of Epigenomics. I've been with Epi since 2016. And so my background is in molecular diagnostics and specifically in cancer screening. So I've worked at various companies, one of which was Third Wave Technologies, where I actually met Jorge, and we got a product cleared for cervical cancer for HPV. So with that, I'll kick it over to Jorge.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Jorge Garces. I serve as President and Chief Scientific Officer for Epigenomics. Have been in the oncology arena for over 20 years. Have a PhD in molecular biology and a business background as well. Very happy to be part of this endeavor as, you know, we have the ability to really make an impact in people's lives with a blood-based colorectal cancer screening test. So nice to see everyone, or hope you have a good day.
So before we leave your bios, I have to sort of pull on a history thread here because it may be a little sort of provocative from an investor perspective, but I do think it's something that people do gravitate towards. Can you guys connect the dots between Third Wave, Hologic, and Exact Sciences? I do think that, again, it's a little provocative from an investor perspective, but it is something that I think people gravitate towards.
Yeah, so obviously there's a connection. Jorge and I were executives at Third Wave. At the time, Kevin Conroy was CEO. Kevin is a friend, someone we've known for a long time. And, you know, we were very successful at Third Wave. We developed an HPV product. When we got through the FDA trial, Hologic came in and bought the company out. As part of the transaction, Jorge and I had to go to Hologic until that product got through its PMA clearance, which it did. And then obviously Kevin left and went to Exact Sciences, and he's really grown that company into the darling of the diagnostics industry. And you know, Kevin's always been a very bright guy, you know, and as a friend, and now we've kind of come full circle. And with my and Jorge's experience in screening, you know, I was approached by Epi to join the company as CEO with the US focus. And so now, we will be entering the market with an alternative product, and one that we feel is a very disruptive technology. But at the end of the day, the good news is Kevin's created a lot of value in this space, and he's done a fantastic job. But, the market's so big, he has less than 2% market share. And so I think ultimately there are going to be many players that are successful in this space. But, we do know it pretty well. And at the end of the day, I think both companies are going to make a difference.
Terrific. Well, thank you. I like to always try to make that connection, to give investors knowledge and how, Exact Sciences with a $14 billion market cap sort of is the darling of the colorectal cancer screening space. Before we sort of jump into more the sort of formal Q&A component, just from a sort of the format of this, we're going to do, it's not going to be a slide turn here. We're going to do a very active Q&A. Investors can submit questions through the Zoom app. If they have any questions, I have received a number of emails from investors with questions already. We'll try to get to as many as possible. I know that the majority of people on the call have a pretty good working knowledge of epigenomics already, but I know we'll have a few people who are new to the company. So maybe Greg, you've already touched on a little bit of the highlights of epigenomics, but can you give us sort of the quick sort of synopsis about why people should be paying attention to epigenomics here?
Sure. Ryan, if you could jump ahead. So the basic highlights of the company are, we're solving a huge problem, and that is in the colorectal cancer screening market, 35% of age-eligible patients go unscreened. It's a big problem because the 35% of patients that go unscreened represent 70% of the deaths. So colon cancer is the second leading cause of cancer deaths in the United States, despite the fact that ultimately this cancer is preventable. So clearly the market is telling us that we need alternative tools to solve this problem, because the current solutions out there are not doing it, whether it's colonoscopy or stool-based testing. The fact of the matter is 35% of people are not compliant with those methods. So that's the issue that we're trying to solve. So the opportunity for us is that there's an 85 million patients in screening age from 50 to 75. So it's a huge market. What we think we're bringing to the table is a solution that's the first ever FDA approved blood test for CRC screening. So it is a disruptive new technology that we think has the potential to reach that 35% of the market that's unscreened. And so for us, while that product is FDA approved, the reality is we are 30 days away from the biggest milestone in the company's history, and that's Medicare reimbursement. And ultimately in the United States, FDA approval is a requirement, but really that's the first step. The main step is reimbursement, because as a screening test, you need the product to be widely reimbursed to be able to, in essence, commercialize it appropriately. So the great news for us is we are 30 days away from that decision. We are confident that it's going to be a positive decision and that Epi-procolon is going to be reimbursed by Medicare this year. So once that happens, then we can actively commercialize the product, and we think the upside of the product is significant.
Terrific. Okay. And I was going to jump right into that sort of CMS conversation, but I did get a few email questions about more the basic science behind Epi-procolon. And I think a lot of us take for granted, because it's FDA PMA approved, that the science works. But I think for new investors, it might be beneficial, Jorge, if you could maybe walk us through just, again, the majority of our audience are generalists, they're not technical folks. So I know that's maybe a bit of a daunting ask to sort of describe a technology for more of a simple audience from a non-science perspective. But can you kind of give us the sort of basics on the mechanism of Epi-procolon, DNA methylation, and septin-9?
Sure, Hogan. So, one really simple way to think about it is that, genes primarily involved in cancer have, two main functions, and that's to speed up cell growth or cell division. And you might have heard of those genes called oncogenes. And then there's genes that are involved in slowing down cell division, and those are tumor suppressor genes. And septin-9 falls in the tumor suppressor bucket in that it acts as a brake to regulate the division of cells. If you get uncontrolled division, then that leads to cancer. And so methylation is a mechanism often used to shut down genes. And so we found that methylation of the promoter region of septin-9 actually shuts the gene down and prevents it from slowing down the cell division, and so therefore leads to cancer. As a marker for colorectal cancer, although septin-9 has been identified in a number of cancers, it is highly associated with colorectal cancer. When we look at, for example, biopsies of colorectal cancer tissues, we find methylated septin-9 in about 97% of all those cancers. And so the idea was, without having to do a biopsy, we know that these tumors go through cycles of cell death, and then the cells that die spill out their DNA into the blood. Would there be a mechanism to detect that DNA out of blood? And that's in essence what our Epi-procolon test is the ability to detect tumor DNA out of blood without having to take a biopsy of the tissue. Hence, liquid biopsy is the name of the technology. So hopefully that helps.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we've sort of done the investor piece intro and the science piece intro. So let's jump into sort of the more sort of thematic questions that I think a lot of people have. And I think if there's one question we get from investors more than any other, it's 70% sensitivity versus 90% sensitivity when we look at sort of Cologuard versus Epi-procolon. So how do you guys address that sensitivity question? How does 70 compete with 90? Is basically the question that's probably the most common that we hear.
Okay, Ryan, if you can jump to the slide, keep going. Back two more. I think it's like slide 11. Yep. Okay, so the reality is in how testing works, there's two, in essence, buckets for testing. There's diagnostic, which is a majority of testing that goes on. So diagnostic is patient has symptoms, you need to find out what's wrong. Okay, and in that world, clinical sensitivity and specificity are fairly analogous with the effectiveness of a test, okay? However, the screening world is different. In the screening world, you are testing patients that are asymptomatic. They're healthy patients. You're looking for someone who probably doesn't even know that they're sick, all right? So what you have here is you have other factors that come into play, and those factors are time and adherence, okay? So on a disease like colon cancer that is very slow progressing, on average, it takes 20 years to go from a polyp to cancer, okay? So what happens here is clinical performance is a factor, but it's also impacted by time. So what you'll see here on slide 11 is in essence the problem of colon cancer and then how screening addresses this problem. So colon cancer, if I had 1,000 patients that were being screened for colon cancer, what you would find is about 65 would develop colon cancer. So the incidence rate of colon cancer is 6 to 7 patients out of 1,000. So that's what the blue bar here represents. If you don't get screened, out of 1,000 patients, 6 to 7 patients will develop cancer. All right. Now, when we interject screening, what you'll notice is the various screening methods all have different intervals or time frame by which they test. So a colonoscopy, for instance, is done every 10 years, okay? Colonoscopy is highly sensitive and highly specific, but it is only done every 10 years. Cologuard or FIT DNA is done every 3 years. That test has a 92% sensitivity. Our test, Epi-procolon, is about a 70% sensitive assay, and so is FIT, anywhere from 70 to 74. And in this analysis, I think it's 74%. So what you see here is when we introduce screening, we reduce the incidence of the cancer. That's the graph on the top. And more importantly, we can reduce the mortality of the cancer. So what you'll notice is FIT DNA has a 92% sensitivity, but done every 3 years, it actually reduces the incidence less than Epi-procolon, which is 70%, because Epi-procolon is done every year. The way for kind of people who are not really experienced in oncology to think about it is cervical cancer. So for instance, the pap smear introduced in the 50s, that test is anywhere to 50 to 60% accurate. So that's not great. However, because that cancer is also very slow progressing, what's happened is that test was introduced. Women started going to their OBGYN every year. And when you test with a 50 to 60% sensitive assay every year, they were able to reduce the incidence and mortality of cervical cancer by over 90% after that test was introduced. So when we think about various tests, the ultimate goal is how effective is it? Does it reduce the incidence and the mortality of the cancer? And what the data clearly shows is that ultimately all of the methods work. So Epi-procolon works, Cologuard works, FIT works, and colonoscopy works. And what you can see is we all work relatively the same. We're all within the same 95% confidence interval of each other. So ultimately, the story here is what the guideline societies are now saying, which is the right test is the one that gets done. All right. That is why 70% of the deaths come from the 30 to 35% of the market that's unscreened. So ultimately, if we can get that population screened, the incidence and mortality of this disease will reduce greatly. So at the end of the day, when people talk about, oh, it's, you know, the sensitivity of 92% versus 70, the ultimate question is how effective is the test? How much does it reduce the likelihood that I will either get the disease or that I will die from the disease? And ultimately what you see is we are all relatively the same. We perform slightly better than Cologuard, you know, FIT performs slightly better than us, but at the end of the day, the right answer is just get screened. Now, when you take into account adherence, and Ryan, if you go to slide 12, what you'll see is people's willingness to do the test has a big outcome. And that's actually quite honestly one of the big problems with the current available methods is people really don't want to do an invasive technology like colonoscopy, or they don't want to do a stool test. A blood test is much easier to use and patient friendly. And when you incorporate adherence into the paradigm, which is a very real world reality, what you see is actually a blood test does have the opportunity to reduce the incidence and the mortality of cancer more than all of the other methods. So we do believe this is going to be a breakthrough technology, as a blood test is really going to change the paradigm in how we think about screening.
Jorge, do you have anything to add maybe to that conversation?
I think Greg covered a lot of it, but one really good way to think about it is, you know, the shots on goal that you have to detect these cancers. So they're very slow progressing cancers. And, you know, if you have a test like colonoscopy, you in essence only have 3 colonoscopies over a lifetime to pick up that cancer, right? If it's every 10 years. With Cologuard, you have 8 shots on goal, right, over a 25-year period. And with the blood test or even a FIT test, you have, you know, really 25 chances to catch that cancer because you're doing it more frequently. Then the question becomes, well, am I willing to do something 25 times versus 3? And clearly the data shows that people are not willing to do a colonoscopy. There's very low compliance with a stool test. People don't want to do something out of the everyday and play with their stool. And so a blood test fits very well with the standard of care for these patients. They go see their doctor every year. They get annual exams. It's just another blood tube from the same blood draw that they have to provide in order to get screened. So it takes very little effort from the patient to participate in screening by incorporating a blood test. And so really ease of use way out benefits all the other factors that are often mentioned in these type of screening programs.
And really, the sensitivity for Epi-procolon is quite similar to FIT.
Absolutely.
I mean, so
yeah.
you know,
So
that's really a gold standard. That's a gold standard test. Really, after colonoscopy, it's FIT as the next sort of the gold standard, and your label indicates that, correct?
Across all stages of cancer and across advanced adenomas, which is a precancerous state, we have the same sensitivity as FIT. We've done head-to-head comparisons to show that. And really going back to the cervical cancer example that Greg, laid out there, HPV screening came along many, many years later with a sensitivity of, funny enough, about 92, 93%. And what, is recommended for cervical cancer today is you either do a PAP, which is only about 55% sensitive. You do a PAP every 3 years, or you do an HPV test every 5 years. So again, you're spacing out the frequency of the test based on the sensitivity, but they're both equally effective. So, I think it's to just highlight specificity and sensitivity only tells a part of the story, right? The entire story is how willing are people to do the test, how frequently can you do the test, and in the end, can you reduce the mortality and the incidence of the cancer implementing any strategy? So.
Okay, well, thank you. That's great. So I guess if there's the sort of topic du jour is you're a month away from a huge CMS reimbursement decision. You already have an FDA PMA approval. How does what is CMS looking at that FDA, what is this? How is the CMS process different than what FDA looked at when they approved Epi-procolon back in 2016?
Yeah, so Ryan, if you can go to, there's a reasonable and necessary slide for there's CMS. I think it's the other way. It's towards the beginning. Yeah. One more. Or go back, sorry. Right there. So when FDA looks at a test, FDA is looking at the safety and efficacy of the test. So the big difference in FDA versus CMS is CMS's criteria is defined as what's called reasonable and necessary. So reasonable is they need to check the boxes it's safe and effective. So there are some tests that are presented to CMS that are not FDA cleared, and they have to determine, is it reasonable that it's safe and effective? Once it's FDA cleared, that's a box that the FDA checks, and CMS just needs to make sure it's there. The big thing that CMS looks at is what's called clinical utility. What are the long-term benefits and harms of the test in the patient population that the test is designed for? And so for Medicare specifically, is it going to provide a benefit to Medicare patients? All right, is there a long-term benefit to doing the test? So ultimately in this space, that is proven by the data we just showed you, which is from a microsimulation model that shows, does the test reduce the incidence and the mortality of the cancer? That is the goal, and that's the definition of clinical utility. So the other main part of the decision from CMS is it necessary? Okay, and so there they look at, well, is there a problem in Medicare patients that we're trying to solve? And this one's very easy. We know that there's over 9 million unscreened Medicare patients. So clearly a significant issue in Medicare. And so a blood-based test has the opportunity to save over 225,000 lives and detect over 400,000 cancers just in the Medicare population. So ultimately, that'll be their decision criteria. So I think if you go to the next slide, Ryan, ultimately we believe that, the decision outcome will be positive because A, it's an FDA PMA approved test. So we check the box that it's safe and effective. We have peer-reviewed, published data showing the long-term benefits and harms, so documenting the clinical utility of the test. During the NCD review process, which has been ongoing, the first 30 days was a public comment period. About 95% of the comments have been supportive of coverage of blood tests and specifically Epi-procolon. And then in April of this year, in addition, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, also included Epi-procolon in their CRC guidelines. And lastly, it is cost effective. That's technically not a criteria for CMS, but the reality is that CMS has to look at cost because they have a certain amount of money. And, you know, this one's a no-brainer for CMS in that right now, the big issue CMS has with colon cancer screening is they carry an undue burden of the treatment cost for colon cancer. And that is because it's a slow progressing cancer, the average onset for colon cancer is at age 67. So in essence, the majority of the treatment of colon cancer falls on Medicare. And as we know, 70% of those people that die from colon cancer are because they didn't get screened. So what's happening is people not getting screened in their 50s and early 60s are resulting in Medicare paying for expensive colon cancer treatments at 67 and beyond. So Medicare has published a paper saying that if they can increase the screening rates by 10%, Medicare can save anywhere between $18 and $32 billion by avoiding the cancers at a later stage in life, at which time they cover. So for them, it really is a very cost-effective solution because a blood test is really, you know, a disruptive technology that truly has the opportunity to increase the screening rates, which haven't changed in decades. And now we have the opportunity to go out there and get this 10% incremental screening benefit in the United States.
You brought up the public commentary period, the first 30 days of the NCD. And when I went through the various comments, I found it interesting that competitors, or should I say maybe future competitors like Freenome and Guardant, who have liquid biopsies in development, were commenting in favor of Epi-procolon's reimbursement, or at least the reimbursement of liquid biopsies for colorectal cancer screening. Why would your competitors or future competitors, because they still got a clinical hurdle to overcome and a regulatory hurdle to overcome, but would they be commenting in favor of reimbursement for Epi-procolon?
The number one reason is the actual NCD is not specific to Epi-procolon. The NCD is for blood-based tests for CRC screening. So this is going to be the standard for all blood-based tests in the future for Medicare to provide coverage. All right, so the reality is, as the first entrants into the space, we are in essence laying the groundwork for others behind us. That's just the reality of being the first. Now that said, you know, so obviously it's in Guardant and Freenome's and all of their companies' best interest that this NCD is issued and issued it such that the standards for coverage are achievable by them. So ultimately, this is the direction CMS has been going. If you look back at the NCD they did for advanced cancer therapeutic selection from next-gen sequencing, it's known as the Foundation One next-gen sequencing NCD. They did something very similar. They made it generic, not to the Foundation One test, but basically any test that used NGS to identify therapeutic selections for late-stage cancer would get coverage if it got FDA approval and, you know, was utilized in the therapeutic selection for that disease state. So that is the criteria by which then any new FDA approved product would get coverage. Now, for us, we believe that, you know, this NCD will come out in 30 days. We know that we are probably going to have at minimum a 5-year window. We're the only blood test that is available in the market. So Ryan, if you can go forward a couple slides, keep going right here, back, slide 20. What you'll see is that the reality is that Guardant, Freenome, and even Exact is doing a blood trial right now. They have all just started their trials. With COVID-19, most of those trials are on hold because they're not doing screening colonoscopies at this time. each of those trials is going to have to enroll somewhere between 10,000 and 14,000 patients. That's the standard now to get a PMA approval and CRC screening. So those trials are more than likely going to take them 3 years to complete. Once they complete them, then they got to go through the FDA review process. It is a PMA. Average PMA time can be anywhere from 18 to 30 months. So we believe if everything goes perfect for each of those players, they're still 5 years away. Now, what is interesting is each of those players is talking about sensitivity and specificity. And as we've just discussed, that's only part of the story. Ultimately, the story is how effective are they at reducing the incidence and the mortality of the cancer. So what you can see here on slide 20 is even if we give each of these companies credit that they're going to develop a test that has 90% sensitivity and 90% specificity out of blood, what does that mean for the reduction of the incidence and mortality of the cancer? Well, again, it depends on what the interval is. So here, if you look at a 90-90 test with a 3-year interval, it actually is less effective than all the other available methods to date. So that test is actually inferior.
It's the last 3 bars, Greg, just so the...
Yeah, the last 3 bars of each graph. They show a 90-90 test at 3 years, 90-90 at 2, and 90-90 at 1. So what you see is that test would have to, in essence, achieve an interval of every 2 years or every 1 year to ultimately be a competitive test. However, that is going to be a significant challenge for those players because ultimately price plays a big factor. Most of those tests that they're talking about developing are expensive next-gen sequencing tests. They're going to need to, in essence, get reimbursement similar to Cologuard, which is about $500. All right. The challenge with that is that Medicare has clearly priced the value of colon cancer screening across multiple different tests. So if you look at Cologuard over a 10-year period, it's about $1,700. Our test done every year over a 10-year period is $1,900. A colonoscopy done once every 10 years is about $2,000. So the range is somewhere between $1,700 and $2,000, and it's a very tight range. If I have to do the 90-90 test every year to achieve the clinical benefit necessary, well, now you're talking about $5,000 over a 10-year period because they need $500 for that test. It won't work. They will never get that pricing from CMS. So ultimately, not only do we believe we clearly have a 5-year runway, even if all of the other tests are successful and can get to market 5 years from now, they have an economic problem of how do they become competitive at an interval that makes sense to them. So ultimately, we believe the ability for Epi-procolon to be successful is not only the next 5 years, but in the long term as well. Because Epi-procolon is a PCR test, very simple to run, and ultimately will be very cost competitive in the future as well.
Gotcha. So not only do they have a challenge as far as, needing to, complete their clinical studies and validate, and have successful clinical studies, get through FDA, but they'll also have to either figure out some sort of cost-effective way to market these things, either by driving their COGS down or something along those lines to be competitive, really. Yeah,
and the reality is that, I mean, their hope is that they can somehow get the COGS down to $100, right? But that's still significantly higher than a PCR test. And so ultimately, even at a COGS of 100, if they can achieve that, they still need to charge about $500 for that test, because in their model, not only do you have to account for the cost of the actually running of the test, but they're independent CLIA labs. So they need a sales force, they need a compliance department, right? They need to find out how they're going to get their hands on the blood. So in essence, are they going to go build 3,000 phlebotomy centers across the United States to collect blood? I mean, you have to be able to get your hands on the sample. So their sample acquisition costs will probably be significant as well. So there are some significant economic barriers to that model.
Okay.
And going
So,
back, Hogan, to the NCD, I think it's in their interest to support our NCDs because in essence, they piggyback off the 3-year effort that we've been putting into getting this NCD issued. And it's to Medicare's benefit as well, because it's really not very pragmatic for them to issue an NCD that is product specific every time, right? You think about how many products are out there, they would have to issue numerous NCDs. So, you know, the strategy is to generalize the NCDs based on intended use or application, and then be able to set general criteria that, you know, many different products can fit into.
okay, that makes sense. And maybe I'm going to jump ahead a few questions that I sort of had prepared, but you brought up the commercialization strategy that these new technologies may face. And you know, one of the objections we do get when we talk to investors about epigenomics is this sort of visceral response, which is how are they going to compete against Exact? You know, Exact has got this incredible sales organization which has been out there, and you know, they're tenacious in tracking people down when they get their prescription for Cologuard. But you know, you guys are going about commercializing this very different than how Exact went about commercializing their technology, Cologuard. So can you maybe walk us through how you envision commercializing Epi-procolon as opposed to how Cologuard or Exact did?
So if you can go to the reimbursement slide, Ryan, where we have the rates for the various tests, HPV, I think it's a couple slides after this. Yeah,
Right
but you, 16 maybe? No, sorry.
18.
18, right there. So the way the market works and what you got to understand is what Exact did was not the norm in this industry. If you look at screening tests to date, the standard has been, so let's take HPV for cervical cancer, a huge screening market in the United States. The way the HPV screening market works is IVD kit manufacturers sell a test to labs in the United States. So that is both large reference labs like Quest and LabCorp, but also hospital labs. And by doing that, what happens is, in essence, the hospital lab or the hospital system share in the revenue stream. So the way it works here is that HPV is reimbursed at $35. So what will happen is if a health system has their own CLIA lab, which many of them do, they collect the sample, they send it to their own lab. Their lab gets $35 for running the HPV sample. So the big players in the space like Hologic, Roche, Siemens, Abbott, they make these kits, whether it's HIV, HCV, and they sell them to the hospital system, and they will, in essence, price them such that the labs have the opportunity, or the hospital systems have the opportunity to make a profit on getting reimbursed at $35, or for HIV, $85. So we, in essence, are tapping into an already existing and well-established process on how lab testing works in the United States. Exact went the very opposite way, which is they're their own CLIA lab. So what happens is if a doctor writes a prescription for Cologuard, that sample never goes through the local hospital system. It only goes to Cologuard's lab, Cologuard runs it, and Cologuard gets $510 in reimbursement. Our process will work very differently. So what will happen is if you take, for example, in New York, if you're a Mount Sinai patient, you go see a Mount Sinai doctor, what would happen is we would sell this test to the Mount Sinai lab. All right, you would then go get an Epi-procolon. You'd go downstairs after seeing your doctor in the Mount Sinai office. You'd go down to the Mount Sinai phlebotomy station. They'd draw your blood. And in essence, Mount Sinai would receive $192 for screening you for colon cancer. As an example, if we charged Mount Sinai $100 to buy our kit to run that test, Mount Sinai would make $92 in profit. So now the Mount Sinai Health System is sharing in the revenue stream for screening you for colon cancer. So ultimately, we believe that in essence, the health system will do what is in their benefit, which is screening patients who, ultimately have the appropriate reduction of the incidence and mortality to cancer, but it also is economically viable for them to now collect $192 for collecting one incremental tube of blood. It will be a highly valuable molecular diagnostic test in the space. So if you imagine a Quest and LabCorp, for instance, each of them has over 2,000 phlebotomy centers across the United States. They process more blood than anybody. In essence, we're already tapping into that network, the people who are already handling the blood samples, and LabCorp is already ordering the test. Quest already uses the test as an LDT. We believe they'll switch over once the NCD comes out because you need an FDA approved test for reimbursement. So ultimately, we believe that this distribution model is the appropriate one because it has been tested, it has stood the test of time. And if you look at all of the other large molecular diagnostic tests in the United States, that is the method for delivery.
And is it safe to say that, Exact has basically owned the branded colorectal cancer screening market for the past 6 years? I mean, there's fit tests out there, but they're not truly marketed and branded. So, I mean, really, there's 30 plus million patients that are the unscreened. They've sold 1 million. They do it 1 million a year. That's a massive market that has not been tapped into by any other branded product out there. Is that a safe assumption?
That is correct. So now, to be fair, Exact's done everyone a huge favor of they've increased awareness, right? And at the end of the day, that benefits us as much as anyone else. But yes, we will be the only other truly branded non-invasive product out there. FIT is a commodity product. It's very cheap. Right. There's no branding on FIT or FOBT that's really material in the market. So at the end of the day, Cologuard's been very successful. They've done a lot of very brilliant things with their direct-to-consumer campaign, and we're very supportive of it. At the end of the day, the market is so big that there are going to be multiple players that are successful. We don't have to, in essence, take share from Exact. The reality is Exact has, now that you include patients from 40 to 50 in the screening category, there's now over 100 million patients that are supposed to be screened. Right? Exact did 1.7 million tests last year. They're less than 2% of the market. So the ultimate reality is the market's so big, there are going to be many players that are successful. And if Exact increases awareness and more people get screened, but now that's great. Ultimately, as a company, our belief is a patient wants to get a colonoscopy, great, go get a colonoscopy. They want to do a Cologuard test, great, go do a Cologuard test. The fact of the matter is that there's a huge problem in the market. 35% of it doesn't get screened, and there is a significant opportunity for the blood test for Epi-procolon to drive screening compliance.
The other thing I think it's important to add is I think our path to profitability is a lot simpler than Exact's, right? Because they operate a CLIA lab. There's two components to their tests. There's a FIT component, and then there's a DNA component that they have to do. And so their cost of goods, it's not as attractive. So as Greg said, not only can we leverage the distribution channels of existing players like LabCorp and Quest to get the product out there, we only have to sell to about 200 high complexity labs in the United States rather than having to go and drive volume from the end users, which is over 200,000 of them. So I think the distribution effort is much lower. And then from a COGS perspective, this is a PCR test. So right. It's very easy to reach, 80 plus margins on a PCR test in this market. So, I think that's another important feature to think about.
Right. So, I think it's, because it's a PCR test, I think we can assume that as you get this test sort of going on volume, that you can drive those COGS down to to pretty reasonable numbers. I know at Third Wave, you talked about getting COGS down into what, around maybe $10. Was that right?
Yeah. So big companies at scale, a PCR kit at $10 is incredibly achievable.
Okay.
So,
and if we look at maybe $100, you're selling the test to the LabCorps and the Quest at $100, you've got 90% gross margin potentially at scale. So that's obviously very attractive.
yes. And so that's why we believe there's long-term viability in the test, that there's a significant opportunity to be cost competitive ultimately at some point way in the future when that is necessary.
Yeah.
Right. This is a bit of a loaded question, but I think it's important because of your history with Third Wave and Hologic, and being part of M&A in the diagnostic space. But can you just from a sort of macro perspective talk about how prevalent M&A is for sort of single asset? And I know you've got a pipeline. We're not going to have time to talk about the pipeline, unfortunately. But really, let's consider you a single asset company with CMS approval in hand, or CMS reimbursement in hand. What's the prevalence of companies like this? In your experience, what's the prevalence of M&A in this space? I guess that's the sort of loaded question that I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that smaller microcap companies that have a key significant single product, a lot of times that they are approached and ultimately taken over by larger organizations for many reasons. The ability to commercialize the infrastructure already in place. Another one, as an example, in this space, unique to molecular diagnostics, are instrument platforms, right? So as you talk about very high volumes, you look at HPV, and some labs run, 400 or 500 tests a day. Well, when they do that, they run on automation. And so, a lot of the larger players in this space have FDA approved automation platforms, and they're looking for content to add onto their platforms. So it is very common for, single assay companies to ultimately be acquired. That said, we're public. The reality is a publicly traded company. We're for sale every single day on the market. And, we manage the business as what do we need to do to grow the company as optimally as possible. And so that's how we will continue to manage it to in essence, put ourselves in position to commercialize this product and to realize the significant opportunity in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, I see our job is to maximize shareholder value, right? Maximize the value for our shareholders. And so, I think that, for example, if you look at Exact, they've created a $15 billion entity, but that's taken time. They've, since Kevin took over, it's taken, over 10 years to do that. And, over, I would say, $3 billion of investment in terms of the capital he's raised. So, I think that the equation we always look at is time and the level of investment, and then the return, right? So, in the end, do we maximize value by taking advantage of a larger entity's infrastructure, speed to market, et cetera? And for a lot of companies, that's been the answer. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the answer for Epi, but it certainly has been the answer for a lot of companies to leverage the investment and the infrastructure of a larger company to be able to get the product out there quickly. So.
Sure, that's great. I appreciate that, guys. That's a bit of a kind of a loaded question anyways. Just a quick question as far as August 28th is a preliminary CMS decision. The final CMS decision is November 28th. What can we expect?
Hey, Ryan, I think you froze up for a second. Are you there?
Greg, I can hear you, but Hogan is frozen. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I'll answer that in regards to the process. So The way the NCD process works is a proposed decision is issued by August 28th. Following that will be a 30-day public comment period, much like the public comment period we went through the first 30 days of the NCD. Okay. Then when that public comment period closes, by statute, CMS has to issue a final decision by November 28th. So when CMS issues the final decision, assuming it's positive, which we believe it will be, in essence, the test goes live for Medicare reimbursement that day. So any patient with a date of service on the date that the final NCD is issued would be covered.
Okay. Sorry, I think we had maybe a little IT hiccup there. I'm not sure on what
No
end
problem.
it was. This is the risk of doing these things live, of course. So I kind of heard the majority of that, but basically you said that the August 28th decision is followed by a public commentary period again, and then they sort of confirm the earlier decision from on November 28th.
Correct.
Okay. We've got some investor questions that I want to get to quickly.
Okay.
A couple of questions around intellectual property. Do you guys want to comment on intellectual property around Epi-procolon?
So I don't know, Greg, if you want to comment, but I think that we have a very strong IP portfolio as a company. I mean, it's one of the great assets to Epi, with over 300 patents either granted or under review. And our core patents extend out to about 2026. But we have extensions that we've been filing, obviously, to take it beyond that. We obviously, in terms of barriers to entry, IP is an important one, but as we've discussed in the past, these clinical trials, FDA approval, and reimbursement are, an additional 3 very large hurdles for other companies to enter the market. So, we certainly keep a very close eye on IP. And make sure that we have not only the freedom to operate, but also can prevent others from using our technology in this application.
Perfect, Greg. That summed it up nicely. Anything different from you or anything to add?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. I guess it's important for us probably to also talk about, this is a binary decision come August 28th. I think, we're all, this is, the market cap is so reasonable that, the upside obviously should outweigh, or should be attractive to those of us who like these sort of catalyst investments. But what is the downside here? What happens if, you outline, the reasons why CMS approves this. And I think that, you've checked all the boxes that CMS appears to want you to check. But what happens if on August 28th, we don't get the favorable decision? What's the next step for you guys? What process can you go through to sort of revisit CMS approval?
Yeah, there is an appeal process for CMS. It's called a reconsideration. So we would obviously apply for a reconsideration process. The reality is that a negative decision on the NCD, is not something we'd be looking for. There is a path forward with a negative NCD. However, it will take us time to, in essence, go through an appeal process with CMS. So, we actually, think the likelihood of that is very, very small because, like you said, Hogan, at the end of the day, we have checked all of the boxes for CMS. And the reality is CMS does not accept and then do an NCD unless they feel that there's a strong likelihood that they're going to cover. So if you look at the history of NCDs, most of them are for coverage. And the reason is that because there's a hurdle for them to even accept and then process the NCD, they have to believe there's adequate evidence that it's going to provide a benefit to Medicare patients. That's their standard. So by default, just getting an NCD accepted and then processed means that they really believe that there's evidence there that this is going to go forward. So when you add on that FDA approval, clinical utility data, guidelines, there really is not a box that we haven't checked that ultimately would provide coverage. And if you look at all of the other screening tests like HIV, HPV, and you look at the NCDs for those tests, basically it's not specific to any one test. It's a generic NCD that says Medicare will cover any HPV test that's FDA approved.
Right.
That's the standard.
Okay. No, I think that's perfect. Couple questions we're getting, and this actually probably ties, and we only got a few minutes left here. So I know some people, so from a cash burn perspective, balance sheet, where do things currently stand? What are your plans for future capital needs? Can you address that?
Yeah, so we had our shareholder meeting in June, and we have the approval to raise capital in two ways. So, first of all, we have enough cash to get through Q1 2021. So we have enough cash to get through our major milestone decisions. That said, we don't have the cash necessary to obviously go commercialize the product. So we have two mechanisms to raise capital. One is a PIPE, so we can issue out up to 10% of our shares, which would be about 4.7 million shares as a PIPE, and we can do that quickly and add cash to the balance sheet in short order on that. The other is a rights offering. We have an additional 40% of our outstanding shares we could issue in a rights offering. That process is longer. It typically takes us about 3 months from start to finish to execute a rights offering. That includes a prospectus. We go to market, we announce it. So we have said on our previous earnings call that obviously we will look to raise capital this fall. We need to, because we only have enough cash to get through Q1 2021. As we enter into the fall, again, we have two mechanisms. One, we can work on quickly and add some cushion to the balance sheet right away. And then the other one is of a longer term process, which would push us out into later in the year to raise capital.
Okay. And that I think kind of, dovetails into maybe the last sort of, maybe not even a question, but just sort of a comment. I mean, obviously you're not on a national US exchange. I know people would love to see you traded on NASDAQ. I know you've got restrictions because of your German roots on how that can be sort of accomplished. Can you just talk to people about how they may buy this, how you can buy, the stock trades in Germany on Frankfurt, but also to other exchanges. Can you just talk about those two exchanges? Because I think there's more liquidity there.
Yeah, so the main exchange that we trade on is Xterra, which is the electronic platform in Frankfurt. So ECXDE. We are seeing increased liquidity on that exchange, which is good. We've seen a significant rise in the stock price in the last 4 months, obviously in anticipation of the NCD decision upcoming. We think there's obviously much further growth availability in the stock. I mean, we believe the stock is significantly undervalued. I don't think there's any rational person that would argue that if we could wave the magic wand and take a company with the first ever FDA approved liquid biopsy product 30 days away from a reimbursement decision and put them on the NASDAQ, the company wouldn't be worth at least 3 times what it is today. So, but the reality is that, we trade on the Frankfurt exchange, but it is, the ECDX is fairly liquid. We think there's significant opportunity and upside for everyone involved, because ultimately when you look at, again, what Exact's done, they've done great things in the market, but they eclipsed 15 billion this week, I think. So there's obviously a lot of room for market share growth in this space. I mean, you're talking about a company that's got 2% market share and is a $15 billion market cap. So clearly for us, we believe as a blood test, there's significant upside.
Well, terrific. I think with that, we've touched the bottom of the hour. That's exactly 1 hour. I want to thank Greg and Jorge for giving us their time. we are obviously very enthused and excited about the prospects for epigenomics. We'll be very active and following you as we head into this massive decision on August 28th, which we believe will be favorable, much like yourselves. With that, I know there were some questions we didn't get to. This has been recorded. We will publish it on our website, so this will be you'll be able to revisit this. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Ryan, in the background for being our IT guy. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate everyone taking the time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Hogan.
Bye-bye.